Let's go over this novel way to reverse leptin resistance. I haven't heard anybody else talk about it, so it's important to shed light on this. I've talked in other YouTube videos on so many ways to reverse leptin resistance. I will link those videos at the end of this video. But in this video, we're going to focus on the novel way to reverse leptin resistance by raising baseline dopamine levels. And it's really exciting because I haven't seen it being talked about before. This is going to be a game-changing tool. Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Zaldivar. I have a PhD in nutrition and exercise physiology from the University of Miami. I was featured on the first ever TV show on the Carnivore Diet, the Reverse TV series, and I have taught for over a decade at multiple places like the University of Miami and the American College of Sports Medicine, coached thousands of clients, and you check out the testimonials on my website. And I focused on raising baseline dopamine levels. That was the topic of my dissertation, and also the way that I managed to lose 30 pounds and maintain it. I will remember to show you my transformation picture at the end. And also, this is really how I help most of my clients target all kinds of issues from weight loss to addictions to low motivation. We focus on raising their baseline dopamine levels. All right, this study was published in 2006. And the title is Activation of Dopamine D2 Receptors and How That Lowers Circadian Leptin Concentrations in Obese Women. So the moment I read the title, I was very excited and I wanted to make sure that I covered it on my channel. So what this study looks at is how dopamine can lower leptin levels. So what is the D2 receptor? The D2 receptor is a protein on the cell surface of your brain cells that when activated by dopamine, you actually feel the effects of dopamine. So it's not just about releasing dopamine. You want dopamine to be released from one brain cell attached to its receptor on the cell surface of an adjacent brain cell or neuron. And that's usually the D2 receptor. That's the type of dopamine receptor that is really heavily implicated in addiction and the most widely studied when it comes to addiction. You have D1, D2, D3, D4, D5. D2 is the one that we really care about the most. What is leptin? Leptin is a hormone that is produced by our fat cells, and it tells the brain that we're not hungry anymore. So when leptin is working well, your fat cells are releasing leptin and it goes to your brain, it suppresses your appetite, and you don't eat as much, you lose weight. It kind of maintains a certain body weight set point. What happens when you are overweight or obese is that you have more fat cells, so they release even more leptin. You would think that's a great thing, right? More leptin means more appetite suppression, means I will lose weight easily because I won't be hungry. Every time I gain a pound or two of body fat, I'll have more leptin, I'll have more appetite suppression, and then I will lose the weight because I just won't feel hungry for the next few days. But that's not what happens. Because the more body fat cells you have, they also release a lot of inflammatory molecules in addition to the leptin. And also to gain weight, usually you're eating unhealthy foods, which in and of themselves increase inflammation. So all this inflammation is going to interfere with the proper functioning of leptin. And now you have a state called leptin resistance, whereby if I measure your blood levels of leptin, they're going to be elevated. And at the same time, it's not going to work. You have a lot of leptin that just doesn't work. You have a state of leptin resistance, and this is where people feel that no matter what they do, they can't lose weight. They're at a plateau. And so we need to reverse that leptin resistance. So how do we reverse leptin resistance? It's really important that we lower leptin levels to regain leptin sensitivity and reverse leptin resistance. The faster you can normalize your leptin levels, the faster and more sustainable your weight loss is going to be. And that means you're going to reverse leptin resistance very quickly. The study I'm going to talk about is exciting because it adds one more very powerful tool to lower leptin levels outside of the things I've already mentioned in other videos. So I've talked a lot in the past about dopamine receptors, specifically the D2 receptors and their function in setting your baseline dopamine level. Basically, your baseline dopamine level, which sets the tone for your baseline mood, energy, happiness, motivation level, is determined by how many D2 receptors you have in your brain. When we've been eating a lot of sugar, carbohydrates, or drinking a lot of alcohol, or any kind of addiction, even video gaming a lot, any kind of maladaptive behavior that you feel you don't really have a lot of control over time, what it does is that it starts to destroy the amount of D2 receptors that you have in your brain. It's a form of brain damage if you think about it. And what happens over time as those habits take hold, your overall D2 numbers, D2 receptor numbers start to drop over time. So over time, your baseline dopamine level starts to go down. And that means if you are naturally a happy, excited, motivated person, if you've been drinking a lot for years, at the end of, let's say, this 10-year stint of drinking a lot, when you wake up in the morning, you're no longer your same happy, energetic, motivated self. Now your baseline dopamine is so low, the number of D2 receptors are so low that you have to take some form of external dopamine to activate whatever D2 receptors you have left over on your brain. Because if you don't have a lot of D2 receptors left over in your brain, if we can trigger them as frequently as possible, so the more frequency we trigger whatever remaining D2 receptors we have, that can give us some relief. That can give us some amount of relief and makes us feel normal again. Same thing, I mean, you can substitute alcohol for food or any kind of addiction. Now we're going to learn about how raising our baseline dopamine level, in other words, meaning increasing our numbers of D2 receptors, but also increasing overall dopamine synthesis and secretion, how that can also lower leptin levels, thereby reversing leptin resistance very quickly. In this prospective single-blind crossover study, prospective means that they brought in the people and they followed them in real time, as opposed to just seeing them once and asking them based on their memory certain things and trying to find a correlation between two different variables. So prospective studies are always a lot better than retrospective studies, which are based usually on memory and are of a lower quality. So in this perspective, single-blind crossover study, 18 healthy, obese, premenopausal women with a body mass index of 30 to 35 participated. A BMI of 30 to 35 indicates that they are in the obese class 1. So if you have a BMI of 25 to 29.9, you're classified as overweight, and your a BMI of 30 to 34.9 is classified obesity class 1. A BMI of 35 to 39.9 is obesity class 2, and then BMI of 40 or above is obesity class 3, or also known as morbid obesity, that carries the greatest risks for all kinds of diseases. So in this study, every subject underwent 2 8-day treatment periods, one with bromocriptine, which is kind of like, it's like they gave them fake dopamine. Bromocriptine is a dopamine D2 receptor agonist. So when you take this drug, it attaches to the D2 receptor. So the D2 receptor gets activated. It thinks dopamine bound to it. And so you feel the effects of dopamine. And so in the first 8-day period, they gave them this bromocriptine to activate their D2 receptors. And then after those 8 days, they gave a 4-week washout period. And then after that, they gave them a placebo. Actually, they did it in reverse. They did the placebo first, and then they did the bromocriptine. But the point is, there were 2 groups. One group was given sort of like a fake dopamine in the form of this drug, bromocriptine, and then the other group, they were given a placebo. On the final day of every treatment, blood samples were collected every 20 minutes over a 24-hour period to measure plasma leptin concentrations. So here's the great conclusion here, is that short-term bromocriptine treatment significantly reduced mean 24-hour plasma leptin levels compared to the placebo. In other words, if you activate dopamine receptors, whether via a drug or actual dopamine release, you're going to lower your leptin levels. And so if you're depressed all the time and you're trying to see, how can I reverse my leptin resistance? Step number 1, figure out what things make you happy. The happier you are, the more dopamine you're going to create. I will outline a little bit more of a detailed plan of how to increase your baseline dopamine in a second. Another finding of the study showed that bromocriptine increased free fatty acid concentrations, and this increase was inversely related to the decline in leptin levels. So to explain that, basically what they showed is that the mechanism by which activating your D2 receptors lowered leptin levels was by increasing fatty acids being burnt off from the fat cell. And so that's also good to know that they figured out the mechanism of action of how dopamine or anything that can activate the dopamine receptor can lower leptin levels. I'm going to quote the authors here in their conclusion. They said, "This finding provides direct evidence supporting the inhibitory effect of dopamine on leptin secretion and highlights the complex regulation of leptin beyond fat mass alone." Because we used to think that if you just lose weight, so your body fat, total amount of body fat you have on your body is reduced, you're not going to secrete as much leptin. And so over time, you're going to regain leptin sensitivity. In other words, you're going to reverse leptin resistance. But the great thing here is that we have additional options to do that outside of just regulating how much body fat we have on our frame. Another major conclusion of the study by the authors was that raising baseline dopamine levels, they didn't say baseline dopamine, they just said activation of D2 receptors. It's the same thing. Doing that is going to lower leptin levels and reverse leptin resistance for faster weight loss. And most importantly, this is maintainable weight loss, right? Because if you do weight loss the correct way, treating the root cause, then it's easier to maintain that as opposed to losing weight. But maintaining in a state of metabolic dysfunction, which makes it very difficult to maintain that weight loss over the long term. Okay, so what does it mean to raise your baseline dopamine levels? There are different things have to happen for your baseline dopamine levels to increase. One of the things we've already talked about is that you want to increase the number of D2 receptors. Increasing your D2 receptor numbers is going to increase your baseline dopamine, because now, even if you don't have a lot of dopamine in your brain, if you have more D2 receptors, the whatever dopamine you have in your brain has more opportunities to bind to D2 receptors, because you have so many D2 receptors, so you're more likely to feel motivated, happy, lean, energetic, all that stuff all the time. And again, the D2 receptors are particularly implicated in addictions and motivation to move the body. So if you feel like you have zero motivation to work out, it's also caused by a low number of D2 receptors. This is why usually we say, just do it, right? The Nike slogan, just do it. Because when you actually do the thing, when you actually work out, that increases baseline dopamine levels. That increases the number of D2 receptors. So now the next day you have more D2 receptors, so you don't have as much resistance you have to overcome in order to do another workout, so on and so forth. This is the cycle of momentum. You're actually increasing the numbers of D2 receptors in your brain cells. And again, the number of D2 receptors sets the tone for your mood. The higher your D2 receptor numbers, the better mood you are in, the less cravings you have for an external source of dopamine, because your brain has enough dopaminergic activity and it's happy and it's not trying to get some external source of dopamine in the form of a cupcake or a drink or a video game or social media or distraction or anything like that. And now, based on the study, now we know the role that D2 receptors play in regulating leptin levels. The more D2 receptors you have, the lower leptin you have, which in other words, you have reversed your leptin resistance by raising your D2 receptor numbers. Other things that occur that have to occur for us to raise baseline dopamine outside of just the D2 receptor number increase is also increasing calcium levels in the blood. So this is why exercise is such a powerful modality to increase D2 receptor numbers, because whenever you're working out, it increases calcium in the blood. And that increases the amount of dopamine that is created in your brain. The more calcium you have in your blood, the more calcium is delivered to the brain, and calcium activates dopamine release and dopamine synthesis in the brain. Another way we can increase baseline dopamine levels is by increasing levels of the enzyme that creates dopamine. It's called tyrosine hydroxylase. Enzymes are just proteins that fast track or speed track reactions in our bodies. So for example, exercise can increase the levels of this enzyme, tyrosine hydroxylase, which is the enzyme responsible for dopamine production, thereby sustaining higher dopamine levels over time. The more you work out, or the more you do anything that is not very enjoyable, I'll explain why in a second, all those things trigger the body to create more of the enzyme that makes dopamine. So over time, you start having an easier time having more tyrosine hydroxylase activity. So if tyrosine hydroxylase is constantly working better and it's more efficient, you're constantly producing more and more dopamine at your baseline, not just after a shopping trip or after you eat that cookie. At all times, your tyrosine hydroxylase enzyme is always working for you from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep. Another physiological adaptation that happens in our brain as we're raising baseline dopamine is that we have more dopamine transporter, which what it does is after dopamine is released from a brain cell and it attaches to the D2 receptor on the adjacent brain cell, then it needs to be removed from the D2 receptor and taken back to the original cell to recycle it. This is the function of the dopamine transporter. It just clears the dopamine that has already activated the D2 receptors, takes it back for recycling. Cocaine, actually, what it does is that it blocks the activity of the dopamine transporter. So it keeps the dopamine in this gap in between the brain cells. So it keeps hitting those D2 receptors and it keeps activating the D2 receptors for longer period of time. And that over time, obviously, is not a good thing. So intuitively, you would think that this is great. We need to lower the amount of dopamine transporter. And so if I'm working out or trying to raise my baseline dopamine, now I have more dopamine transporter. Isn't that a bad thing? But it's really not. It's just an adaptation because you have so much more dopamine being released when you're increasing your baseline dopamine. You have just so much dopamine being released, activating all these D2 receptors. You just have more traffic happening in your brain. So you will naturally need more taxis that shuttle that dopamine back into the original brain cell to recycle it. You just have more recycling happening. Okay, how do we raise baseline dopamine levels on a practical day-to-day level? Discomfort is your best friend here. Why? Because dopamine is an anesthetic. It needs a really strong reason for it to be manufactured and maintained. So why would your brain waste any time, energy, and effort trying to increase the amount of dopamine it's producing and increasing the amount of D2 receptors it's producing? You have to give it a strong enough signal or reason. And that signal comes in the form of discomfort. So anything that makes you a little bit uncomfortable is going to raise your baseline dopamine. Exercise is the easiest and first thing that comes to mind, right? Exercise, nobody wants to do it. It's a little bit uncomfortable. But if you work out a little bit outside your comfort zone, the more you do that, the greater the increase in your baseline dopamine level. Also, another example would be meditation can do that. And especially the longer and more intense your meditation sessions get. So, with experience, that's how you get better and better at it. That also increases baseline dopamine. I prefer to do visualizations instead of meditation. I prefer to take advantage of this focused mindset instead of in meditation, what do? We're just focusing on the breath or we're focusing on a mantra. With a visualization, we're focusing on our dream goals. That's an energy visualization. And we can also, instead of doing that, we can also focus on a training visualization, focus on, let's say, waking up in the morning successfully in our minds and doing that over and over again. And the brain doesn't know the difference between a visualized scenario and real life. And so the more you're practicing waking up early on time, successfully every time, your brain starts to believe that that's your identity and it does not require as much motivation or discipline in the morning to do that. So but when you're doing those visualizations, it can be a little uncomfortable because your brain wants to wander. It wants to pick up the phone. It wants to check social media. It wants to follow any kind of thought that is not the plan of the visualized session for the day. Whatever thought pops in your mind, you might want to pursue that line of thought. And so in preventing yourself and pursuing that line of thought and bringing your focus back onto what you have decided to visualize on, whether it's an energy visualization that means your dream goal, or whether it's a training visualization, which is practicing successfully completing the tasks that would get you to the dream goal, that has a little bit of discomfort associated with it because you're training focus. And so that's going to increase your baseline dopamine level. The beautiful thing, though, with exercise and meditation or visualization is that even within the session itself, you're going to increase dopamine. So in meditation and visualization, you can increase dopamine release by 65% in a single session. So it actually feels good when you're doing it. And this is also one of the reasons why some people really enjoy working out because even though you are getting uncomfortable, but you're also happy about it because more dopamine is being released in your brain. It's a very strange condition or mental state to be in, but the more you put yourself through those situations, the more you start to enjoy it and understand what I'm talking about. Okay, temperature changes, very cold or very hot, also like cold plunges or sauna are going to increase baseline dopamine. It's just the problem with that is you would need so much more time being exposed to those temperature extremes to effect a significant increase in baseline dopamine, which is why I generally wouldn't recommend those as the best way if you have a lot of way to go. If you know your baseline dopamine is very, very low and you have a lot of work to do, I wouldn't think of, oh, a 1 minute cold plunge or a 2 minute cold plunge or a sauna. That's not really going to move the needle as compared to exercise or visualization. Food restriction also can increase baseline dopamine. I filmed a separate video on this, so I will link it at the end and you can check it out. It's like a very quick, short video that explains exactly how to do that. It's a form of fasting as well that can increase baseline dopamine. And another example would be cleaning up your diet. So removing addictive foods, because if you're constantly getting dopamine from addictive foods, you're constantly destroying your D2 receptors. Just removing those addictive foods is going to be uncomfortable. You're going to have cravings, but if you can push through the cravings over time, you increase your baseline dopamine and you no longer have those cravings. I will send you a free guide on the carnivore diet, a 30-day carnivore diet challenge. I will make sure I send you that. I'll explain how to do it at the end of this lecture. And this is my 30-pound transformation picture that I promised you. So I did a lot of things to do that, but mainly increasing my baseline dopamine level and eating a more animal-based low-carb approach. And so when you sign up to my newsletter, drzaldivar.com/newsletter, you will receive an email from me within 24 hours with a free copy of my 30-day carnivore challenge guide. And if you need more information, more detailed information on how to raise baseline dopamine levels, you can find them in my guides, especially the Dopamine Brain and the Monster Mindset Guide. The Dopamine Brain outlines my brain rehab protocol, which is a specific exercise protocol that can do that. The Monster Mindset Guide goes into the visualizations. If, let's say, you have zero ability to exercise for whatever reason, you can then really focus on the visualizations to do that. If you can do both, that would be the most powerful approach. And then the Monster Mind, the supplements, explains all of the supplements that have been shown to increase baseline dopamine levels or improve your mood. You can find those all, instead of buying each and every guide separately, it's a lot cheaper to get them under the Brain Bundle. And you can check out the details on my website, drzaldivar.com/shop. And if you want to work with me one-on-one, you can find me on drzaldivar.com/coaching with all the packages and all of the options. And again, the guides are on drzaldivar.com/shop. If you found this information helpful, make sure you share this with a friend or family member that you feel might benefit. Also, if you want me to film more content around this topic, let me know by commenting, giving this YouTube video a thumbs up, subscribing, hitting that little notification bell icon so YouTube alerts you every time I post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.